The Federal Reserve's battle against inflation will spark a recession in the U.S., Deutsche Bank warned yesterday, being the first big bank to predict an economic decline in the U.S. Now, according to CNN, the recession, quote, reflects growing concern that the Fed will hit the brakes on the economy so hard that it will inadvertently end the recovery that began just 2 years ago, end quote. So just like inflation, black swan funds are also thriving. Now, black swan funds, which are designed to protect against extreme sell-offs, have grown to more than $5 billion from $3.8 billion at the end of 2020, according to Eureka Hedge Pte. Limited.
ExxonMobil Corporation said on Monday its first quarter results could top a 7-year quarterly record. How wonderful for Exxon. According to Reuters, this is with operating profits from pumping oil and gas alone up $9.3 billion. That's just terrific, isn't it? Host of the Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and Newsweek contributor Pamela Denise Long join us now to discuss. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, guys.
Hi. Glad I didn't have to commute this morning.
Right, but you could have contributed to Exxon's record-breaking quarter. Denise, aren't you so thrilled for these major corporations that are just doing so well in this environment? They're up against so much. It's so difficult making money when you're increasing your prices constantly, but yet they're managing to do it somehow.
Yeah, and if I made the amount that the CEO of Exxon would, I would benefit from paying over $4 a gallon for gas. And it would not be a big dent in my wallet as well as the rest of Americans. It is amazing to me that post-pandemic, and with all that has happened with Ukraine and Russia, that we are allowing, and I will say allowing because there are decisions that are made that contribute to this enormous profiteering, record-breaking profiteering that Exxon and others are seeing. It's offensive.
Max, an economic decline, people are already in bad shape. It would just have, talk to us about the catastrophic effects this would have on working people.
Right. It's funny. When I was reading the article about the Black Swan stuff, I thought about one of my favorite 30 Rock episodes where Tracy Morgan is talking to Larry King about the financial markets in Asia, which he clearly knows nothing about. And he says, Larry, I am not an expert, but I do have a strong opinion. And that's kind of where I am right now. I think Denise said it right. This is record-breaking profiteering, and I want people to really remember that because these same forces that are raking in record profits are also kind of funding the sort of propaganda arm of this assault that is trying to convince us that rising, prices, the kind of inflation squeeze that working people are feeling right now is just the result of kind of acts of God, right? Like the COVID-19 pandemic, like the war in Ukraine, things that we have no control over. But if you look closely, you will see that companies like Exxon and the oil industry writ large, they have been jacking up stock buybacks and dividends over the past year. They are absolutely taking advantage of this geopolitical crisis to stuff their pockets with as much money as they possibly can, while consumers momentarily have the ability to pay it. I think that's one thing that we should remember is that actually what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was bipartisan. Trump started it, Biden kind of continued it. But what the government did was it injected money directly into people's pockets, not just with the stimulus checks, but also the child tax credits, the unextended employment benefits, so on and so forth. And we saw historic drops in poverty momentarily. Now we are seeing the ruling class claw that all back by deliberately jacking up prices. And the inflation has already outpaced wage growth over the past year. Meanwhile, corporate profits rose 37%, which is the most since the Fed started tracking that data, the biggest rise in a single year since 1948. CEOs are on earnings calls bragging about how they've been jacking up prices on all of us. And, we're just going to sit here and wait for a bigger recession to fall on our heads. It is it is class war, right? Richard Wolff famously said this to me on the Real News Network. He said inflation is a form of class war. And I think that's what we are seeing. This is not just an act of God. This is not the market doing what it is. This is people profiting off of death and despair and disruption. And we're all getting screwed like we always do.
Right, and Denise, it has a number of layers to it, right? So, prices are not just, as Max says, the result of this invisible hand moving them around. They're also political, because companies will charge what they can get away with. And so you saw this interesting phenomenon developing where you had some supply chain driven inflation in the very beginning, and then you have this kind of media panic about inflation, and the companies then see this panic going on and see all the conversation, and they see the space then for them to start driving prices up. And as the prices go up, that also then puts pressure on Congress to stop talking about doing a Build Back Better bill, which includes tax increases on these very companies. And so at the same time that they're able to raise prices and increase their record profits, that's putting pressure on the public not to come after them, not to redistribute the gains from the economy in new ways. And so it really does end up being class warfare through multiple means. But the one difference being, usually if somebody's waging war, they're paying a price. The price that they're paying is less than whatever the person they're fighting against is paying, and so that's why it's beneficial for them to wage that war. But they're waging a war, and they're getting paid handsomely to do it.
Yes, handsomely, like the handsomest. It's astounding. I think there are a few things that struck me by what you were saying. Part of it is how in the United States we struggle with this idea of socialism and this idea of, if we were to regulate these companies better, as we should, so that the American public is not getting milked and seeding the retirement plans, the $7 million worth of pension benefits, for example, that the Exxon CEO earns. I think we struggle with the idea of that. I think we struggle with the idea of what is the role of government in business. We struggle with the idea of making and forcing our elected officials to actually do something to benefit the American public, because that feels like socialism. It feels like government dependency. And then I think so many people also are really buying into the idea that this is a Putin problem, right? When the reality is this is your local, national, domestic CEOs who are doing this in large part to the American public.
Well, significant price increases over the past year were reported yesterday, the largest numbers including natural gas increasing 119%, heating oil up 93%, coffee increasing 85%, and WTI crude going up 68%. So, Max, this is just people who need to get to work, people who need, and the cost of food going up, other things. This is really, really hurting people.
It absolutely is. And like I said, that's kind of sadly, how these things always go, is that working people really bear the brunt of this corporate greed and all of this economic malfeasance that has just been so regularized in our system. Because what power do we have over it, right? And like the deck is so stacked against us that even now, given everything that we're talking about, given that we can actually see and hear, right, the earnings calls where CEOs are bragging about their record profits last year, and we're talking like across the board, like so many companies that experienced strikes, workers' strikes last year, had seen their most profitable years ever. Just one example, John Deere. Remember 10,000 John Deere workers went on strike in the fall of last year? This was during a contract negotiation year, when John Deere recorded its most profitable year ever, in the billions, right? And it's like, and at the same time, they were trying to take more from their workforce. They were trying to demand more concessions. And that is the position that we've been put in, because even now, when we can see all of this corporate profiteering, all of this taking advantage of geopolitical crises like the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, I'm watching mainstream media and I'm seeing pundits actually legitimately try to blame workers demanding higher wages for inflation. Right. And as I said, Federal minimum wage has not gone up. Some wages have gone up, which is great, but they have not gone up across the board. And they have not kept up with inflation, which is pretty much the position that working people have been in for the past half century. We have been working more. We've been working longer. We've been working harder. Workers in the United States have been more productive than ever, but more of that productivity has been siphoned off into the coffers of the 1%, the owning class, while workers' wages have largely stayed stagnant over that time. And the cost of living just keeps going up. How long can we keep going in this direction?
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see, people forget that the Arab Spring was really sparked by rising bread prices before it evolved into what it became. And I think we're going to see uprisings, protests, riots all over the world over the next year. I think that's one of the easiest predictions that we can make. But Denise and Max, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Good to see you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.